The genealogist stared at the computer screen. Another colonial Virginia family, land records, marriage certificates, descendants moving west. Families that looked, on paper, entirely ordinary, except for one detail. The Y-chromosome DNA from living male descendants of this family didn't match the story the documents told. The surname was European. The property records showed them as landowners. Later generations were classified as white. But the paternal genetic signature, the unbroken thread passed from father to son across centuries, pointed towards sub-Saharan Africa. How does an apparently white colonial American family carry African paternal ancestry? And why did researchers believe this family might connect to one of the most significant legal cases in the history of American slavery? A court hearing from 1640 that helped transform temporary servitude into lifelong bondage based on race. The investigation that followed would trace one family line backward through Kansas, through Kentucky, through Virginia, through the blurry boundary where race itself was still being legally invented. It would eventually point toward a single African man who appeared in colonial court records more than 3 centuries before anyone had heard the name Obama. That's where this gets strange. Because the person at the end of this genealogical chain, the modern descendant whose family tree researchers were reconstructing, was Barack Obama, the 44th President of the United States. Everyone already knew Obama's father came from Kenya. His African ancestry was obvious, documented, recent, and central to his identity. But genealogists were now arguing that another thread of African ancestry might exist on his white American mother's side. Hidden for generations, genetically diluted almost to invisibility, recoverable only through archival records and lineage DNA. One African connection arrived through a Kenyan student in 1960s Hawaii. The other may have originated with an African servant standing before a Virginia judge in 1640. This is the story of how 2 completely different African ancestral paths, separated by centuries, continents, and entirely different historical circumstances, may have converged in the same family tree. Barack Hussein Obama II was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, on August 4, 1961. His father, Barack Obama Sr., was a Kenyan graduate student studying economics at the University of Hawaii. His mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, was a white American student from Kansas. They met in a Russian language class. Their marriage was brief. Obama Sr. returned to Kenya when Barack was 2 years old. The young Obama grew up between Hawaii and Indonesia, largely raised by his maternal grandparents, Stanley and Madeline Dunham. On the surface, the ancestral divide seemed straightforward. Kenyan father, white Midwestern American mother. An American childhood shaped more by his mother's family than his absent father. When Obama wrote about his identity in Dreams from My Father, he explored what it meant to grow up biracial in America, to carry a Kenyan name and a Kansas upbringing, to feel divided between continents. But was the division actually that clean? Genealogy has a way of complicating stories that seem simple, and Barack Obama's family tree, when researchers began tracing it backward through census records and DNA databases, would turn out to contain several surprises. The most famous one involved a man named John Punch. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand Obama's paternal ancestry, you have to travel to Western Kenya, to the shores of Lake Victoria, where the Luo people have lived for generations. The Luo are one of Kenya's largest ethnic groups, primarily located in what is now Nyanza province. They are traditionally a Nilotic people, with deep roots in the region and a distinct language and cultural identity. Obama's paternal grandfather, Hussein Onyango Obama, was born sometime around 1895. Though exact records from that era are scarce, colonial-era documentation in East Africa was often incomplete, particularly for African families living outside urban centers. Much of what we know about earlier generations comes from family memory and oral history, rather than written archives. Hussein Onyango served as a cook for British colonial officers. He lived through the dramatic transformation of East Africa under British rule. The construction of the Uganda Railway, the establishment of settler farms, the imposition of colonial administration, the Mau Mau Uprising. His son, Barack Obama Sr., was born in 1936 in Nyanza province. Obama Sr. was intellectually ambitious. He attended Maseno School, one of Kenya's
With
prestigious
this simple
secondary
DNA
schools,
kit,
and later
we can
worked as a
trace your
clerk in
ancestry with
Nairobi.
incredible
In
accuracy.
1959, he was selected for a program that brought talented African students to American universities. He flew to Hawaii, enrolled at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and became one of the first African students on campus. That's where he met Ann Dunham. Reconstructing Obama's deeper Kenyan genealogy is difficult. Unlike European colonial settlers, whose births, marriages, and property transactions were extensively documented by church and state, African families often lack the paper trail genealogists rely on. Luo genealogy was traditionally transmitted orally, with family histories preserved through storytelling rather than written records. Where documents do exist, they are often incomplete, inconsistent, or filtered through colonial
Family
administrative
migrated from
categories that
Virginia
don't reflect
down
how
the South
families
Rocky
understood
Road into
themselves.
North Carolina
What we can say
before
with
finally
confidence
reaching
is that
Kentucky.
Obama's Kenyan ancestry is Luo, rooted in western Kenya near Lake Victoria, and that his immediate paternal line includes figures like Hussein Onyango Obama and his grandfather before him. Beyond that, the genealogical record becomes fragmentary. But DNA can sometimes answer questions that documents cannot. Let's talk about Y-chromosomes. Every human has 23 pairs of chromosomes. 22 of those pairs are called autosomes. They recombine each generation through sexual reproduction, mixing genetic material from both parents. The 23rd pair determines biological sex. 2 X chromosomes for females, 1 X and 1 Y for males. The Y chromosome is special. It passes almost unchanged from father to son. A man inherits his Y chromosome from his father, who inherited it from his father, who inherited it from his father, stretching back in an unbroken patrilineal chain. Mutations accumulate slowly along this line, creating distinct haplogroups, branches of the human family tree that can be traced back thousands of years. Y-DNA can tell you about one single ancestral path, your direct paternal line. It doesn't say anything about your mother's side, or your father's mother's side, or your mother's father's side. It's one thread among thousands. Population geneticists have studied African Y chromosome diversity extensively. East African populations, including the Luo, carry a range of haplogroups, many of which are ancient and deeply rooted in Africa. But we need to be extremely careful here. Barack Obama himself has not, to public knowledge, undergone genetic testing that has been made public. His personal Y-DNA haplogroup is not established in peer-reviewed literature. We can discuss what is generally true about Luo population genetics, but we cannot claim specific haplogroup information about Obama unless reliable evidence supports it. This distinction matters throughout this story. Population-level genetics is not the same as individual testing. A genealogical reconstruction is not the same as a DNA confirmation. The documentary record is not the same as genetic proof. When journalists write headlines like "DNA proves Obama descended from," they are often overstating what the evidence actually shows. DNA can be one piece of a larger puzzle, but it's rarely the entire answer by itself. With that caution in mind, let's turn to Obama's maternal ancestry, where DNA played a more direct and documented role. Obama's mother came from a very different world. Stanley Ann Dunham was born in Wichita, Kansas, in 1942. Her parents, Stanley Armour Dunham and Madeline Lee Payne, were white Americans with roots deep in the Midwest and beyond. They moved frequently during Ann's childhood, eventually settling in Hawaii in 1960, just before she enrolled at the University of Hawaii. When genealogists began tracing Ann Dunham's ancestry, they found exactly what you'd expect from a mid-20th century white American family with Midwestern roots: English surnames, Irish surnames, German surnames. Families that had been in America for generations, moving gradually westward from the original colonial settlements on the Atlantic coast. Her father's line, the Dunham family, traced back through Kansas into earlier generations in the American interior. Her mother's line, the Payne family, followed a similar pattern, with ancestors scattered across states like Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, before the trail led further east into Virginia and earlier colonial settlements. The documentary record for these families is much richer than what exists for Obama's Kenyan line, because American local governments maintained extensive vital records, land records, probate files, and census data. Genealogists could trace these families backward through courthouse documents, church registers, and local histories. But there's a problem with maternal ancestry. Women changed their surnames when they married. They appeared less frequently in property records because married women often could not own property independently under coverture laws. Their names might appear in a husband's will, or in a marriage record, or as mothers on their children's birth records. But the documentary trail is thinner than for men. So tracing a mother's line backward often means following her maiden name to her father's line, then following that back to another woman who married in, then tracing her maiden name to her father, and so on. It's like climbing a ladder where every other rung is half missing. Genealogists worked through these challenges step by step, generation by generation. They found colonial American ancestry. They found English immigrants. They found Irish immigrants fleeing famine. They found families moving west with American expansion. And then they found the Bunch family. The Dunham and Payne families weren't unusual in their migration pattern. They reflected the standard westward movement of American families across the 19th century. Madeline Payne's ancestors, Obama's maternal great-grandparents and beyond, lived in Kansas by the late 1800s. But a generation earlier, the family had been in Indiana and Ohio. A generation before that, Kentucky and Virginia. Each generation moved a little further west as American settlement expanded, as land became available, as new territories opened to white settlers. This is genealogy as geography. You follow a family backward and watch the American landscape reverse itself. Suburbs become small towns. Towns become farming settlements. Settlements shrink back toward the original colonial core along the Atlantic coast. Property records show families buying land. Census records show them establishing households. Marriage records connect them to other local families. Tax lists prove they stayed in one place long enough to be assessed. Probate files tell you what they owned and who inherited it. But sometimes the trail breaks. A courthouse burns. A family leaves no will. A woman's maiden name isn't recorded. The surname spelling changes. A family moves to a new county just before the next census, and you lose them for a decade. When that happens, genealogists have to get creative. They look for children's marriages that name their parents. They check land records for adjacent property owners who might be relatives. They search court records for guardianship appointments or debt cases that reveal relationships. They look for families with the same surname in the same county at the same time and try to establish connections through circumstantial evidence. That's how the Bunch family entered the story. Researchers tracing Madeline Dunham's ancestry backward found the surname Bunch appearing in her family tree generations earlier. The family showed up in Virginia in colonial records, then in North Carolina, then moving west with each generation like so many other American families. Bunch. Not an especially common surname, but not rare either. English in origin. Nothing obviously remarkable, except when genealogists started connecting the Bunch family to living descendants and those descendants agreed to DNA testing, something unexpected appeared. Some Bunch descendants carried a Y-chromosome with African genetic markers. The Bunch surname appears in colonial Virginia records as early as the mid-1600s. Various individuals with the name show up in land grants, court records, marriage entries, and tax lists across Tidewater, Virginia, and later in North Carolina. Genealogists attempting to reconstruct the family's origins faced the usual challenges of 17th-century American genealogy. Records are incomplete. Spelling is inconsistent. Relationships are often implied rather than explicitly stated. Multiple men might share the same name in the same county at the same time, making it difficult to distinguish between them. But by combining documentary evidence with DNA analysis of living descendants, researchers built a case that several Bunch families in Virginia and North Carolina might descend from a common ancestor, and that the direct male line carried genetic markers suggesting African rather than European paternal ancestry. How is that possible? How does a family appear white in colonial records while carrying an African Y-chromosome? The answer lies in the way ancestry dilutes over generations. Imagine a scenario. A man of African ancestry in colonial Virginia fathers a child with a European woman. That child is of mixed ancestry. If that child is a son, he carries his father's Y chromosome but receives half his autosomal DNA from his mother. If that son then marries a European woman and has children, his children will be 3/4 European autosomally. But the son will still carry the original African Y chromosome unchanged. Continue this pattern over multiple generations, each generation marrying European partners, and eventually you have descendants who are overwhelmingly European in their total genetic ancestry, who appear phenotypically white, and who are classified socially and legally as white. But the Y chromosome remains a marker of the original African paternal ancestor. This is not a theoretical scenario. It's a documented pattern in families descended from 17th and 18th century mixed unions in colonial America. DNA from living male line bunch descendants reportedly showed exactly this signature: autosomal ancestry that appeared predominantly European, but a Y chromosome haplogroup associated with African populations. That's the clue. But the clue by itself doesn't tell you who the original African ancestor was or how the family came to be classified as white. For that, you need archival records, and the name that kept appearing in the reconstruction was John Punch, Virginia. July 9, 1640, 3 indentured servants stood before colonial magistrates. They had attempted to escape their service by fleeing toward Dutch territory. All 3 were captured and returned. Now the court would decide their punishment. The 3 men were identified in the court record as Victor, a Dutchman, James Gregory, a Scotsman, and John Punch, described as a Negro. The court's decision was split. Victor and Gregory, the 2 European servants, were sentenced to additional years of service plus physical punishment. The record specifies whippings and extensions of their indenture. John Punch received a different sentence: shall serve his said master or his assigns for the time of his natural life, here or elsewhere. Lifelong servitude. Historians cite this case as one of the earliest documented instances in English colonial Virginia, where an African individual received a sentence of permanent slavery, while European servants involved in the same offense received fixed extensions. The case appears at a transitional moment in colonial law, when race-based slavery was beginning to emerge as a legal institution distinct from temporary indentured servitude. Was John Punch literally the first enslaved African in North America? No, African slavery already existed in Spanish and Portuguese colonies. Enslaved Africans had been present in the Caribbean and South America for more than a century. Even in English Virginia, the status of Africans was ambiguous in the early years. Some appear to have been freed after terms of service, while others remained in permanent bondage. What makes the Punch case significant is the explicit court record showing differential sentencing based on African ancestry at a specific moment when colonial law was solidifying racial categories. After this single court appearance, John Punch largely disappears from the documentary record. No definitive record of his children, no definitive record of his later life, no estate inventory or will. For centuries, historians noted the case as an important legal milestone, but knew almost nothing about what happened to Punch afterward, until genealogists started asking whether the Bunch family of colonial Virginia might be his descendants. The proposed connection between John Punch and Barack Obama rests on a genealogical reconstruction that combines documentary evidence, circumstantial historical reasoning, and genetic analysis of descendants. Here's the argument, step by step. First, the surname similarity. Punch and Bunch are phonetically close. In an era when spelling was inconsistent and clerks recorded names by ear, variant spellings were common. A name pronounced Punch could easily be written as Bunch, or vice versa. Surname evolution through spelling variation is well documented in colonial records. Second, chronology and geography. The Punch court case occurs in 1640 in Virginia. Bunch families begin appearing in Virginia records within a generation or 2 later. The timing and location are plausible for a descendant line. Third, racial descriptions. Some early Bunch family members appear in records with ambiguous racial descriptors or in contexts suggesting mixed ancestry. Later generations appear consistently classified as white. This pattern would be consistent with a family of mixed African and European ancestry, gradually being absorbed into white society through repeated intermarriage. Fourth, the genetic evidence. Living male line bunch descendants, individuals who can trace their surname back through multiple generations, reportedly carry Y-chromosome haplogroups more commonly associated with African populations than with European populations. That's consistent with an African paternal ancestor deep in the family's past. Fifth, the genealogical reconstruction. Researchers traced the Bunch family forward through Virginia and North Carolina land records, marriage entries, wills, and estate documents, attempting to connect individuals across generations. They also traced Stanley Ann Dunham's ancestry backward and identified the Bunch surname among her colonial Virginia ancestors. Here's where it gets complicated. The documentary evidence does not provide an unbroken chain of birth certificates from John Punch in 1640 to Stanley Ann Dunham in 1942. That kind of evidence doesn't exist for any 17th century American family. Vital registration didn't exist. Parish records were incomplete, courthouses burned, families moved between jurisdictions without leaving forwarding addresses. What genealogists do instead is build a probabilistic case using the genealogical proof standard, a methodology that combines direct evidence, indirect evidence, negative evidence, and careful analysis to establish relationships even when perfect documentation is missing. The proposed connection between Punch and Bunch relies on surname similarity, which is plausible but not definitive, chronology and geography, which are consistent, Y-chromosome evidence, which is strongly suggestive of African paternal ancestry, documentary reconstruction, which is incomplete but circumstantially strong, and the absence of alternative explanations. No better candidate for the African ancestor has been proposed. Is the case proven beyond doubt? No. A direct documentary chain is missing. Alternative scenarios are possible, but researchers concluded that the reconstruction represents the most plausible explanation given the available evidence. John Punch, the African servant sentenced to lifelong servitude in 1640, likely had descendants. Those descendants likely intermarried with European colonists. The family likely became socially classified as white over time. And one branch of that family likely connects to Barack Obama's maternal line through the Dunham family. If the reconstruction is correct, Obama descends from both the African man and the European colonists, making his maternal ancestry itself mixed race at its 17th century origin, even though the family became white by the 20th century. The surname transition deserves a closer look because it's one of the key pieces of the reconstruction. How plausible is it that Punch could become Bunch? Very plausible, actually. Colonial spelling was wildly inconsistent. The same person might be recorded under different spellings in different documents. Clerks wrote names phonetically. People often couldn't read or write and couldn't correct errors. Families moved to new counties where officials had never heard the name before. The transition from Punch to Bunch requires only a small phonetic shift. The stressed vowel sound changes slightly. The initial consonant cluster changes from P-bar to B, both labial stops easily confused. Genealogists find similar transitions throughout colonial records. Names that seem fixed and stable today were fluid in the 17th century. But surname similarity alone proves nothing. You need the whole package: surname, timing, location, genetic evidence, and circumstantial documentation. In this case, the surname similarity provides a possible pathway. It's not the proof itself, it's the connector between the man in the 1640 court record and the family that appears under a slightly different spelling later. Skeptics rightly point out that coincidences happen. Maybe there was a European immigrant named Bunch who arrived separately and whose descendants just happened to carry African Y-chromosome markers through some other unrelated pathway. But no such alternative has been documented, and the alternative would require explaining how a supposedly European origin family acquired African paternal DNA. That's harder to explain than a simple surname evolution from Punch to Bunch. Researchers defended their reconstruction by arguing that while no single piece of evidence is conclusive, the cumulative case, surname, location, timing, genetics, and circumstantial documentary links, makes the Punch to Bunch connection the most parsimonious explanation. To understand how an African man's descendants could become socially white, you have to understand how race itself was constructed in colonial America. Modern Americans often assume racial categories have always existed as they do today. But in early colonial Virginia, race as a legal and social category was still being defined. In the 1620s and 1630s, the colony included English indentured servants, African laborers, whose status was often ambiguous, Native Americans, and small numbers of other Europeans. Servitude was common, but not always permanent. Some Africans gained freedom after completing terms of service. Some owned property. A few even owned servants or enslaved people themselves. The legal structure of lifelong racialized slavery emerged gradually over the mid to late 1600s. A series of Virginia laws incrementally defined African ancestry as a basis for permanent enslavement, restricted the rights of free black people, prohibited interracial marriage, and clarified that children inherited their mother's enslaved or free status. By the early 1700s, the racial caste system had hardened. But in 1640, when John Punch received his sentence, the system was still crystallizing. If Punch fathered children with a European woman, whether through marriage, informal union, or coercion, the children's status would depend on their mother's status. If the mother was free, the children were free. If the father was enslaved but the mother was not, the children inherited freedom from the mother under the evolving principle of partus sequitur ventrem. The child follows the condition of the mother. Those children would be of mixed ancestry, but not automatically enslaved. As the children and grandchildren of such unions intermarried with European colonists over successive generations, their African ancestry became diluted autosomally. Appearance became more European. Social classification followed appearance and behavior. By the third or fourth generation, descendants might possess only a small autosomal fraction of African ancestry, might appear entirely European phenotypically, and would be accepted as white by their communities, especially if they moved to new settlements where no one knew their family history. But the Y chromosome would remain unchanged, a genetic marker of the original African male ancestor, even as everything else about the family became European. This process wasn't unique to the Punch/Bunch family. It happened in multiple colonial families. Genealogists have documented other cases of families that appear white in later records, but carry genetic evidence of earlier African ancestry. Virginia's racial laws attempted to prevent this kind of boundary crossing, but the laws came after the fact. Many mixed families were already established. Geography helped. Families moved, records didn't follow. Social classification could shift. By the time the Bunch family reached North Carolina, then Kentucky, then further west, their African ancestry was centuries in the past and likely unknown even to themselves. Historians sometimes describe this phenomenon as passing, individuals of African ancestry living as white. But that term can be misleading. It implies conscious deception, a deliberate choice to conceal identity. For many families like the Bunch line, the process was more gradual and less intentional. A mixed ancestry family in early colonial Virginia might be known locally as mixed. Their children, marrying white spouses, might be seen as mostly white. Their grandchildren, raised in white communities with white spouses, might be fully accepted as white. Their great-grandchildren might not even know their African ancestor existed. This wasn't necessarily passing in the sense of a secret identity. It was reclassification over time. The genetic ancestry remained, traces of African DNA persisting in some chromosomes, but the social identity changed. And in America, race was fundamentally a social classification enforced by law, not a biological category defined by genetics. The Bunch family, if descended from John Punch, would have crossed that boundary over multiple generations. Early generations were probably known to be mixed. Later generations were accepted as white. Eventually, the African origin was forgotten entirely. The Y chromosome persisted because it passes unchanged from father to son. But autosomal ancestry, the rest of the genome, was progressively diluted through European intermarriage until descendants were genetically and phenotypically European, with only the Y chromosome preserving evidence of the original African paternal line. This raises a profound question. At what point did the family stop being African and become white? The answer is, there's no single moment. Social identity is not DNA percentage. The same family could be classified differently in different places or different times, based on appearance, reputation, marriage, property ownership, and community acceptance. By the time the bunch descendants reached Kansas in the form of Madeline Dunham, the African ancestry was so distant and so diluted that no one in the family had any reason to know it existed, except for the Y chromosome quietly persisting in male line descendants, waiting for modern genetic testing to reveal its origin. If the genealogical reconstruction is correct, the historical irony becomes almost overwhelming. John Punch, an African man, received one of the earliest documented sentences of lifelong slavery in English colonial America in 1640. His descendants, over many generations, intermarried with European colonists. The family became socially white. They moved west with American expansion. Eventually, one branch of that family produced Stanley Ann Dunham. Ann Dunham married a Kenyan student, and their son became the first African-American president of the United States in 2008. One branch of Obama's family tree might reach back to an African man whose legal case helped establish racialized lifelong slavery in Virginia. Another branch reaches back to 20th century Kenya. The first African connection is centuries old, legally obscured, genetically diluted, and socially white by the modern era. The second African connection is recent, culturally remembered, and central to Obama's lived identity. Both threads converge in one person. 368 years separate John Punch's court case from Barack Obama's presidency. That's roughly 12 to 15 generations, depending on average generational length. If you work out the math, Obama would share approximately 1/4096th to 1/32,768th of his autosomal genome with John Punch, assuming no genetic contribution from Punch through any other line. That's a vanishingly small fraction. It might not even be detectable in a commercial DNA test. It represents essentially 0% of Obama's total genetic inheritance. But genealogically, it's one ancestor among thousands. And historically, it's an extraordinary connection, a circle closing across centuries of American racial history. Now shift the focus completely. Different continent, different century, different kind of migration. Among Stanley Ann Dunham's documented ancestors is a man named Falmouth Kearney. Kearney was born around 1832 in the village of Moneygall, County Offaly, Ireland. He was the son of Joseph Kearney, a shoemaker, and the family lived in modest circumstances in a small rural village in the Irish Midlands. In 1850, at roughly 19 years old, Falmouth Kearney left Ireland. He boarded a ship bound for New York during one of the darkest periods in Irish history. Ireland was still reeling from the Great Famine. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland's population collapsed. The potato blight destroyed the primary food source for millions of rural Irish Catholics. Starvation killed approximately 1 million people. Another million or more emigrated. By the time Kearney departed in 1850, the worst mortality was past, but the social and economic devastation continued. Villages were emptied, families were shattered, entire communities vanished. For young men like Kearney, emigration offered survival. America promised work, land, and opportunity, or at least the possibility of not starving. Falmouth Kearney traveled alone. Passenger manifests record his departure from Liverpool and arrival in New York. From there, he made his way west, eventually settling in Ohio, where he married Charlotte Holloway in 1854. The couple had several children. They lived ordinary working-class lives. Falmouth died in 1878. His widow remarried. His children grew up, married, and had their own children, spreading across the Midwest. One of those descendant lines eventually produced Madeline Payne, Obama's maternal grandmother. That's the factual genealogy. But to understand what it meant, you have to zoom out and see Kearney as one individual within a vast demographic catastrophe. The Great Irish Famine was one of the worst humanitarian disasters in 19th century Europe. Ireland's population depended heavily on the potato. It was calorie-dense, easy to grow on small plots, and could sustain a large population on limited land. By the 1840s, millions of rural Irish Catholics lived on tiny parcels of rented land, growing potatoes as their primary or only food source. When the potato blight, a fungal disease called Phytophthora infestans, arrived in 1845, it spread rapidly. The potato crop failed. The next year's crop failed, and the next. The British government's response was inadequate and shaped by ideological opposition to large-scale relief. Food continued to be exported from Ireland even as people starved. Workhouses overflowed. Diseases like typhus and dysentery spread through weakened populations. Those who could leave did. Emigration surged. Ships carried hundreds of thousands of Irish emigrants across the Atlantic to North America. Many traveled in horrific conditions on overcrowded coffin ships, where disease and death were common during the voyage. Those who survived the crossing often arrived with nothing. They took whatever work they could find: manual labor, domestic service, canal digging, factory work. Irish immigrants faced discrimination in American cities, where "No Irish Need Apply" signs appeared in job advertisements, and Irish Catholics were viewed with suspicion and hostility by Protestant Americans. But the alternative was worse. In Ireland, people were dying. Falmouth, Kearney was part of that exodus. One young man among a million others. His departure from Moneygall was a personal decision, but it was shaped by forces far beyond his control. Agricultural disease, colonial economic policy, mass starvation, and the unraveling of rural Irish society. His story is not unique, it's representative. But because his descendants eventually included Barack Obama, genealogists traced his specific journey and identified his specific origin, turning one anonymous Irish emigrant into a named individual with a documented family and a place of origin. Moneygall is a tiny village straddling the border between County Offaly and County Tipperary in central Ireland. In the mid-19th century, its population was measured in hundreds, not thousands. It was a rural agricultural community like thousands of others across Ireland, small, close-knit, and dependent on the land. Joseph Kearney, Falmouth's father, worked as a shoemaker. That placed the family slightly above the poorest agricultural labourers, who owned no land and survived on potato cultivation. Shoemakers were craftsmen, skilled tradesmen who could earn money from their craft, even if they didn't own significant property. Parish records in Moneygall document the Kearney family across several generations. Baptisms, marriages, and burials appear in the registers of the local Church of Ireland and Catholic churches. The family appears to have been Protestant, which was a minority status in that region. Genealogists traced the Kearney line back several more generations into the 18th century, finding ancestors who were also craftsmen and small landholders. The family was not gentry or aristocracy. They were working people, artisans, small farmers, and tradesmen. This kind of ancestry is typical for most Americans if they trace their roots back far enough. Not kings or nobles. Not plantation owners or great merchants. Ordinary people working ordinary jobs in ordinary villages. What makes the Kearney line interesting isn't aristocratic glamour. It's the fact that a teenager from a tiny Irish village left everything behind, crossed an ocean, and started over in America, and that his descendants eventually included a president. When Obama visited Ireland in 2011, he traveled to Moneygall. The village celebrated the connection. Residents greeted him as a distant cousin, and he visited the local pub, drank a pint, and acknowledged the Irish branch of his ancestry publicly. It was a symbolic moment, a recognition that Ancestry can connect a US president back to a small Irish village, and that migration stories like Falmouth Kearney's are part of the fabric of American identity. Before going further, it's worth addressing a common genealogy myth that surfaces whenever a president's ancestry is investigated. Within days of Obama's election, multiple online genealogy enthusiasts claimed to have traced his ancestry back to medieval European royalty. Some claimed he descended from Charlemagne. Others proposed descent from various English kings. These claims are almost always dubious. Here's why. First, medieval genealogies are notoriously unreliable. Documentation becomes sparse as you move back before the 16th century. Parish registers don't exist before the Protestant Reformation in most places. Royal genealogies were carefully preserved, but connections between royalty and commoners were rarely documented in detail. Second, pedigree collapse means that if you go back far enough, everyone with European ancestry shares many of the same ancestors. By the time you reach the medieval period, the number of genealogical ancestors you have mathematically exceeds the total population of Europe. meaning you must descend from the same individuals multiple times through different lines. Third, many royal ancestry claims rely on speculative medieval reconstructions published in old genealogical compendia that lack modern evidentiary standards. Researchers in the 19th and early 20th centuries sometimes connected families based on surname similarity or guesswork, and those errors have been repeated ever since. If Obama has documented colonial American ancestry, it's mathematically probable that some of those lines eventually trace back to medieval Europe. And if you go back far enough, yes, some lines might statistically intersect with nobility or royalty. But the claim that he descends from a specific king through a specific documented chain is almost never supported by reliable evidence. The more honest statement is, like most people of European descent, Obama probably shares some distant medieval ancestors with European royalty. But identifying those specific ancestors and proving connections is essentially impossible, given the limitations of medieval records. The genuinely interesting ancestry is not the speculative medieval stuff. It's the documented migrations of families like Falmouth Kearneys, the punch-to-bunch reconstruction, the convergence of multiple continents in one family tree. Those stories are real. The medieval king stories are usually fantasy. Obama's maternal ancestry includes multiple additional branches, each representing a different migration pathway into America. Some lines trace back to English immigrants who arrived in colonial Virginia and New England in the 17th century. These families were part of the early waves of English settlement, arriving as indentured servants, free settlers, or members of religious communities seeking land and opportunity in the New World. Other lines trace to later German-speaking immigrants who arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries, often settling in Pennsylvania and the Midwest. German immigration was one of the largest European migrations to America, bringing farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who established German-speaking communities across the interior. Welsh and Scottish ancestry also appears in the maternal tree, reflecting the broader British immigration patterns that contributed to American population growth. Each branch represents a different historical moment and migration motive. The colonial English lines connect to the earliest phases of American settlement. The Irish line connects to famine and 19th century mass migration. The German lines connect to European religious conflict and economic migration. The Scottish and Welsh lines connect to Highland clearances, economic opportunity, and the expansion of British emigration networks. What's important is that none of these individual branches is unique. Millions of white Americans have similar ancestry: English, Irish, German, Scottish. These are extremely common ancestral backgrounds for Americans descended from European immigrants. What makes Obama's ancestry interesting is not any single branch, but the combination, the convergence of multiple European migrations with two separate African ancestral threads, one through Kenya, one possibly through colonial Virginia, all meeting in one family in Hawaii in 1961. This is where we need to address another common misconception about ancestry. You've probably seen ancestry breakdowns presented as precise percentages: 35% English, 20% Irish, 15% German, and so on. These numbers are estimates, not exact measurements. Commercial DNA tests work by comparing your DNA to reference populations. They look for genetic patterns common in Ireland, or Germany, or West Africa, or East Asia, and estimate what percentage of your DNA matches those patterns. But the results are probabilistic. Small differences in algorithms or reference databases can produce significantly different percentages. The same person tested by different companies often gets different results. More importantly, percentages don't tell you about individual ancestors. You can have one Irish great-great-grandparent and receive more than the expected 6.25% Irish DNA from that person due to random inheritance patterns. Or you can receive much less, or effectively zero, because after enough generations, it's statistically possible to inherit no detectable DNA from a specific ancestor. Genealogical ancestry and genetic ancestry are not the same thing. Obama genealogically descends from Falmouth Kearney, an Irish emigrant. That's documented fact. But what percentage of Obama's DNA came from Kearney? Impossible to say without DNA testing, and even if we had that data, Kearney himself was not 100% Irish genetically. He had his own mixed ancestry from earlier generations. The lesson: be skeptical of precise ethnic percentages. They're useful for understanding broad population patterns. They can confirm that you have ancestry from a particular region, but they're not measuring rods you can use to assign exact national percentages to someone's identity. Obama's maternal ancestry includes documented Irish, English, German, and potentially colonial African heritage. Exactly what percentage of his DNA came from each population is a different question, and one that can't be answered with precision without direct genetic testing. Now we can talk more systematically about how these two approaches work together. Genealogy uses documents: birth certificates, marriage records, death certificates, wills, land deeds, parish registers, census records, passenger manifests, court documents, military records. These sources tell you relationships: who married whom, who their children were, where they lived, when they died, what property they owned, sometimes what occupation they held. Genealogy builds family trees. It answers questions like, who was this person's great-grandmother? When did this family move from Virginia to Kentucky? What surname did this woman have before she married? DNA is different. DNA doesn't tell you names or dates or locations. It tells you biological relationships and population affinities. Y-DNA tells you about direct paternal inheritance. Mitochondrial DNA tells you about direct maternal inheritance. Autosomal DNA tells you about your total genomic ancestry and can identify biological relatives who share DNA with you. DNA is powerful for solving mysteries that documents can't answer. It can reveal unexpected parentage. It can connect adoptees to biological families. It can identify unknown ancestors through cousin matches. It can confirm or reject proposed genealogical reconstructions. But DNA without documents is just data. You know someone is related to you, but you don't know how. You know you have African ancestry, but you don't know which ancestor or when they lived. The strongest investigations combine both approaches. In the Bunch case, documents provided the framework: family names, locations, chronology, and the John Punch court record. DNA provided the critical clue: the African Y-chromosome signature in male line descendants. Together, they built a circumstantial case for a connection that neither method alone could establish conclusively. That's how modern genealogy works. You use every available tool. You corroborate findings across multiple sources. You distinguish between what you know for certain, what you can infer with confidence, and what remains speculative. Let's talk about Y-DNA in a little more detail, because it's central to the Bunch family investigation. The Y chromosome is one of the two sex chromosomes. Males have one X and one Y. Females have two X's. Sons inherit their Y chromosome from their biological father, unchanged except for occasional mutations. That Y passes from grandfather to son across generations, creating a direct genetic line that parallels the genealogical surname line in patrilineal cultures. Because the Y chromosome doesn't recombine with the X chromosome during reproduction, unlike the other chromosomes, which shuffle genetic material between parents, it remains relatively stable over time. Mutations do occur, small changes called single nucleotide polymorphisms, and variations in short tandem repeat regions. These mutations accumulate slowly, creating branches on the human genetic tree. Population geneticists group Y chromosomes into haplogroups based on these mutations. Haplogroups represent ancient lineages that diverged thousands of years ago. Some haplogroups are more common in certain populations. Haplogroup R1b is common in Western Europe. Haplogroup E1b1a is common in West and Central Africa. Haplogroup A is associated with populations in East Africa. When you test someone's Y-DNA, you can determine their haplogroup and see which population groups carry similar Y chromosomes. This is what reportedly happened with male-line Bunch descendants. Their Y chromosomes grouped with haplogroups more common in African populations than European populations, suggesting that their direct paternal line, surname and all, originated with an African ancestor rather than a European one. But remember, the Y chromosome represents only one ancestor out of thousands. A man with an African Y chromosome can still have overwhelming European autosomal ancestry if every other line in his family tree is European. That's why the Bunch family could appear white while carrying an African Y chromosome. Mitochondrial DNA works similarly, but for the direct maternal line. Mitochondria are structures inside cells that produce energy. They have their own small genome, separate from the DNA in the cell nucleus. You inherit your mitochondria from your mother. She inherited hers from her mother, and so on. mtDNA passes from mother to all her children, but only daughters pass it to the next generation. Sons carry it, but don't transmit it. Like Y-DNA, mtDNA doesn't recombine. It accumulates mutations slowly over time, allowing researchers to group mtDNA into haplogroups. Has Obama's mtDNA been studied? Not reliably in published research. His direct maternal line is Stanley Ann Dunham, Madeleine Payne, Leona McCurry, Della Wolfley, and so on. If we had mtDNA from Obama or from any woman in that direct chain, we could identify his maternal haplogroup. But without direct testing, we can't assign a haplogroup. We can make probabilistic guesses based on the known European ancestry in that line, but guesses aren't data. The important point is that mtDNA, like Y-DNA, represents only one genealogical line. Obama's maternal side includes thousands of ancestors. mtDNA would trace only his mother's 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 mother line, one thread among thousands. The phrase mother's side of the family means something much broader in genealogy than what mtDNA measures. Most of the ancestry discussions people care about involve autosomal DNA. Your genome contains 22 pairs of autosomal chromosomes, plus the sex chromosomes. You inherit one chromosome from each pair from your mother and one from your father. These chromosomes recombine during reproduction. Segments from your maternal grandfather and maternal grandmother shuffle together before your mother passes one chromosome to you. Same for your father's side. This recombination means your autosomal DNA is a mosaic. You carry segments from all your recent ancestors, but in unpredictable proportions. On average, you inherit 50% from each parent, 25% from each grandparent, 12.5% from each great-grandparent, and so on. But on average is the key phrase. Due to random inheritance, you might inherit 14% from one grandparent and only 10% from another. Or you might inherit 0% from a specific great-great-great-grandparent just by chance. As you go back further, the probability of inheriting zero DNA from a genealogical ancestor increases. By the time you're looking at 10th-generation ancestors, many of them contributed no detectable autosomal DNA to you, even though genealogically you descend from them. This is why you can have a documented genealogical ancestor from the 1600s and still show 0% of that population's ancestry in a DNA test. Autosomal DNA tests compare your genome to reference populations and estimate what percentage of your DNA matches each population. This gives you the familiar pie charts: X% West African, Y% British, Z% Irish, and so on. These estimates are useful for broad ancestry, but they're not precise measurements. They're probabilistic assignments based on statistical models. For Obama, if he were to take an autosomal DNA test, we'd expect to see roughly 50% East African ancestry from his father and roughly 50% European ancestry from his mother. The exact breakdown of the European portion, how much Irish, English, German, and so on, would depend on how the testing company's algorithm interpreted his DNA. Would an autosomal test show African ancestry from John Punch? Probably not. Punch lived 12 to 15 generations ago. The amount of autosomal DNA Obama inherited from Punch, if any, would likely be below the threshold of detection. It might be a fraction of a percent, statistically indistinguishable from noise. But genealogically, the relationship could still exist. And genetically, the Y chromosome in the Bunch male line still carries evidence of it. Now we can step back and see the full picture. Barack Obama's ancestry includes a direct paternal line from the Luo people of Western Kenya, traceable through family memory and colonial era records. A documented Irish branch through Falmouth, Kearney, an emigrant from Moneygall who fled famine and started over in Ohio. Multiple colonial American lines that trace back to early English settlement in Virginia and New England. German immigrant ancestry from families who arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries. And if the reconstruction is correct, a possible descent through the Bunch family from John Punch, whose 1640 court case represents a landmark moment in the development of racialized slavery in colonial Virginia. These are not abstractions. Each line represents real people who lived specific lives. A teenager leaving Ireland, a student crossing from Kenya to Hawaii, a family moving from Virginia to Kentucky to Kansas, an African man standing in a colonial courtroom. These lives converged, generations separated by centuries and oceans somehow contributed to the same individual. That's what genealogy does. It compresses history. It shows how the large-scale forces, slavery, colonialism, famine, migration, war, economic change, play out in actual family trees, and it reveals something that simple ethnic percentages can't capture. Ancestry is not a pie chart. It's a network of relationships stretching backward through time, shaped by geography, law, chance, and choice. This is one of the most striking aspects of Obama's genealogy. Africa appears twice in his family tree, but in completely different ways. The Kenyan connection is recent, visible, and culturally continuous. Obama grew up knowing he had a Kenyan father. He wrote about it. He visited Kenya. He identified publicly as African American. The Luo ancestry is part of his lived experience and public identity. The possible African connection through John Punch is ancient, hidden, and culturally severed. It reaches back nearly 400 years to colonial Virginia. It passed through generations of families who didn't know it existed. It survived as a genetic trace, a Y-chromosome, long after the family became socially white and the African origin was forgotten. One connection comes through the 20th century, the other through the 17th. One is remembered, the other was lost. One is autosomal and visible in appearance and identity. The other is patrilineal and detectable only through specialized DNA testing. These two African ancestries are not equivalent in any meaningful cultural or personal sense. Obama's identity was shaped by his Kenyan father and his experience growing up as a black man in America. The distant 17th century connection, if it exists, has no bearing on that identity. But genealogically, it's fascinating. It suggests that Obama's ancestry isn't simply half African, half European. It's more complicated than that. His white American maternal side may itself contain an African thread, a thread that represents one of the earliest documented cases of permanent racialized servitude in English America. That's not a biological fact that changes who Obama is. It's a historical fact that complicates how we think about ancestry, race, and American identity. When the John Punch connection was first proposed by genealogists, it made headlines. Why? Not because distant ancestry determines who someone is. Obama would be the same person whether or not John Punch was his ancestor. The story resonated because it compressed 4 centuries of American history into one family tree. The Punch court case is a landmark in the history of slavery. It represents a moment when racial categories were being legally codified, when African ancestry was becoming a basis for lifelong enslavement, when America was defining who counted as fully human. If Punch's descendants gradually became white, that reflects the fluidity and instability of racial categories over time, the way families could cross racial boundaries through intermarriage, migration, and social reclassification. If one of those descendants eventually produced a president, and that president was also the first African-American president, the historical irony is profound. A family line that began with enslavement eventually produced the most powerful political figure in the country. A family that escaped slavery by crossing the color line and becoming white eventually reunited with African ancestry through a completely different route 3 centuries later. That's not destiny. It's not genetics determining history. It's the way real human stories can loop back on themselves in unexpected ways. The discovery mattered because it revealed that the familiar narrative, Kenyan father, white American mother, concealed layers of complexity that genealogy could uncover. It mattered because it showed how racial boundaries that seem fixed and permanent are actually porous and historically contingent. It mattered because one family tree could contain both the origins of American slavery and the presidency of the first black president. That's symbolically powerful, but symbols should not be confused with science. When the story broke, headlines simplified it beyond recognition. DNA proves Obama descended from first slave. President's mother had secret African ancestry. White House family tree actually black. Each of these headlines distorts the actual findings. First, DNA did not prove the John Punch connection by itself. No one sequenced Barack Obama's personal genome and found a genetic marker labeled John Punch. The evidence was a combination of documentary genealogy tracing the Dunham family backward, Y-chromosome testing of living male line bunch descendants showing African paternal ancestry, surname analysis suggesting punch-to-bunch evolution, and chronological and geographical correlation. That's a strong circumstantial case, but it's not the same as direct genetic proof. Second, John Punch was not the first slave in America. Forms of slavery and forced labor existed in the Americas long before 1640. Spanish and Portuguese colonies had been using enslaved African labor for more than a century. Indigenous peoples were enslaved by European colonists. The Punch case is significant as one of the earliest documented instances in English colonial Virginia where African ancestry explicitly determined a sentence of lifelong servitude, but the headline claim is historically inaccurate. Third, Stanley Ann Dunham did not have secret African ancestry in any culturally meaningful sense. If the genealogical reconstruction is correct, she had one African ancestor, approximately 12 generations in the past. After centuries of intermarriage with European ancestry families, her autosomal DNA would have been overwhelmingly European. She grew up white. She was raised as white. She identified as white. Society treated her as white. A distant genealogical ancestor does not retroactively change someone's lived identity or social classification. Fourth, Obama's maternal family was not actually black. Genealogically, they may descend from an African man. Genetically, after many generations, they were predominantly European. Socially and legally, they lived as white Americans for centuries. Race is not purely biological. It's a social category that changes across time and context. The real story is more nuanced and more interesting than the headlines. A family's ancestry can be genealogically African, genetically European, and socially white, all simultaneously, because race is not a simple biological fact. Headlines erase that nuance because complexity doesn't fit in 10 words optimized for clicks. Let's be absolutely clear about what genetic testing cannot tell us. DNA cannot tell us what language John Punch spoke, whether he was born in Africa or born in the Americas to African parents, what region of Africa his ancestors came from, whether he had a family before enslavement, whether he resisted his sentence, whether he passed down stories to his children about where he came from. DNA cannot tell us how the Bunch family experienced their own ancestry, whether early generations knew they had an African ancestor, whether they consciously chose to identify as white or whether social classification simply shifted around them, what stories they told their children, whether they preserved any cultural memory of their origins. DNA cannot tell us whether Stanley Ann Dunham ever knew about the Bunch family's possible African ancestry, whether it would have mattered to her, how she understood her own identity. DNA cannot tell us what someone's political beliefs are, what their values are, what kind of person they are, or how their distant ancestry shaped their lived experience. Genetics preserves biological inheritance. It traces patterns of mutation and recombination backward through time. It reveals population movements and shared ancestors. But it doesn't encode memory, culture, language, belief, or identity. Those things are transmitted through families, communities, and cultures, and they can be lost even when genes persist. The Y chromosome from John Punch might still exist in living descendants. But whatever Punch knew, believed, remembered, or experienced is gone. We have a court record and a genetic signature. That's all. History requires combining genetic evidence with documentary evidence, archaeological evidence, and historical context. And even then, enormous gaps remain. Now we arrive at the paradox that makes this story so compelling. Look at Barack Obama's family in 1961. Kenyan father, white American mother. The division seems obvious: African side, European side. But follow the genealogy backward, and the categories become unstable. The Kenyan side connects to the Luo people of Western Kenya, but the Luo themselves have a migration history. They moved southward from the Nile Valley region over centuries. They experienced British colonialism. They navigated changing political and economic systems. Identity is not static, even within a single ethnic group. Obama Sr. himself crossed enormous cultural boundaries, from rural Kenya to Nairobi to Hawaii to Harvard. His son grew up in Hawaii and Indonesia, not Kenya. The African side of Obama's family is itself shaped by colonialism, migration, education, and transcontinental movement. The white American side, meanwhile, is not simply European. It contains Irish famine refugees. It contains German immigrants. It contains colonial English settlers. And it may contain an African paternal line that goes back nearly to the beginning of English settlement in Virginia. The categories that seem clear in the 20th century dissolve under historical scrutiny. Families crossed racial boundaries that were supposed to be fixed. A family descended from an enslaved African man became legally and socially white. Centuries later, a descendant of that family married a Kenyan man, and their son became the first African-American president. That's not a biological destiny written in DNA. It's a historical irony produced by centuries of migration, law, social change, and individual choices. The lesson is not that everyone is secretly mixed race, or that racial categories are meaningless. The lesson is that ancestry is messier than the labels we use to organize it. DNA crosses boundaries, families cross boundaries, history crosses boundaries, and sometimes all those crossings converge in one person whose family tree becomes a map of contradictions. The genealogists asked a simple question: who were Barack Obama's ancestors? The answer turned out to be far more complicated than a conventional biography would suggest. His father's family connected him directly to 20th century Kenya, to the Luo people of Western Lake Victoria, to families navigating British colonial rule, Kenyan independence, and the social transformations of mid-century East Africa. That ancestry was recent, culturally remembered, and central to Obama's identity. It shaped how he understood himself and how the world understood him. His mother's family connected him to a different set of migrations. To Falmouth, Kearney, a 19-year-old Irish emigrant fleeing famine in 1850, crossing the Atlantic with no money and no guarantee of survival. To colonial Virginia families who arrived in the 1600s and moved westward with each generation as America expanded. To German-speaking immigrants who settled in the Midwest. To English, Scottish, and Welsh ancestors whose names appear in land records, marriage registers, and census pages across multiple states and multiple centuries. And potentially, through the Bunch family, to John Punch, an African servant whose 1640 court case in colonial Virginia became one of the earliest documented instances of lifelong racialized servitude in English America. That last connection remains probabilistic rather than absolutely proven. The evidence combines documentary reconstruction, surname analysis, chronology, geography, and Y-chromosome DNA from living Bunch descendants. No birth certificate explicitly names John Punch as an ancestor. No single document closes the genealogical gap. But the cumulative case, built from court records, land deeds, marriage entries, racial classifications, genetic testing, and careful historical reasoning, suggests that the connection is plausible and represents the most likely explanation for the available evidence. If correct, the historical symbolism is extraordinary. John Punch's court case occurred in 1640, at a moment when colonial Virginia was still defining what slavery would mean, what race would mean, and how the two would be connected. His sentence of lifelong servitude helped establish a legal framework that would eventually become the foundation of American racial slavery, a system that would last for more than 2 centuries and shape every aspect of American society. His descendants, if the reconstruction is accurate, intermarried with European colonists. They acquired land, they moved west. Over generations, they became socially and legally white, even as the Y-chromosome quietly preserved evidence of their African paternal origin. 12 or more generations later, one branch of that family produced Stanley Ann Dunham, She traveled to Hawaii. She met a Kenyan student. And in 1961, their son was born. 47 years later, that son became the first African-American president of the United States. The circle closed across nearly 4 centuries. A family line that may have begun with one of the earliest legal cases defining American slavery eventually produced the most powerful political figure in the country. A man whose African ancestry, paradoxically, came through both his Kenyan father and possibly his white American mother. That's not genetic determinism. Distant ancestry does not encode destiny or dictate identity. Barack Obama is not John Punch. He does not carry Punch's memories, experiences, or cultural knowledge. The genealogical connection, if it exists, is a historical fact, not a mystical inheritance. But it's a historical fact that matters because of what it reveals about how American history works. Race in America has never been biologically simple. The legal categories were constructed to be rigid and binary. You were white or you were black, enslaved or free, citizen or property. But actual human ancestry refused to cooperate with those boundaries. Families crossed lines, genetics mixed, social classifications changed, people moved, laws shifted. And over time, families whose origins included African, European, and indigenous ancestry could end up classified in different racial categories, depending on appearance, location, marriage, wealth, and historical moment. The Bunch family appears to have crossed that boundary. Starting as a mixed family in colonial Virginia, they eventually became socially white through generations of intermarriage and westward migration. The African ancestry didn't disappear genetically. It persisted in the Y-chromosome, but it disappeared socially, legally, and culturally. Then, in a twist that no one could have predicted, one descendant of that family married a man from Kenya, and their son's African ancestry, arriving through an entirely separate path 3 centuries later, became the defining fact of his identity and his presidency. 2 African ancestral threads, one ancient and hidden, one recent and visible, both converging in the same person. That's not a story about percentages or DNA pie charts. It's a story about how real human lives, separated by oceans, centuries, and radically different historical circumstances, can somehow weave together into a single family tree. A young man leaving a tiny Irish village during a famine. An African man standing before a colonial court. Families moving westward through Kentucky and Kansas. A Kenyan student crossing the Pacific for education. A woman from Kansas studying anthropology in Honolulu. 2 people meeting in a Russian language class at the University of Hawaii. Each of those moments was ordinary at the time. Each involved individuals making choices, responding to circumstances, trying to survive and build lives. None of them knew where their descendants would end up. None of them could have predicted that their decisions would eventually converge centuries later in a future president. That's what genealogy teaches when you do it right. Ancestry is not about ethnic percentages or claims of descent from medieval kings. It's about tracing the actual movements of actual people through historical forces larger than themselves: slavery, colonialism, famine, migration, war, economic change, legal boundaries, social transformation. Those forces shaped families, and families carried those histories forward, generation after generation, until they met and merged in ways that no one could have designed or predicted. Barack Obama's family tree doesn't prove anything about genetics determining identity, but it demonstrates something profound about history, that the past is never as simple as it appears, that ancestry crosses boundaries we imagine are fixed, that racial categories are not timeless biological facts, but historically constructed classifications that families could cross, evade, or be reclassified across. That the categories we use to simplify complex realities, black, white, African, European, immigrant, native, are useful labels but incomplete descriptions. And that sometimes, if you trace the genealogy far enough, you find that the most familiar story, a Kenyan father, a white American mother, a child born in Hawaii, conceals layers of migration, transformation, and historical irony that only archives and DNA together can reveal. The genealogists found what they were looking for, ancestors. But they also found something else, a reminder that ancestry is not a collection of percentages to be added up and divided. It's a network of human stories stretching backward through time, shaped by forces both vast and intimate, carrying contradictions and ironies that no simple narrative can contain. And in Barack Obama's case, that network of stories happened to compress centuries of American and global history. Slavery and freedom, migration and settlement, famine and survival, colonialism and independence, into one family tree that still, even now, raises uncomfortable questions about what ancestry means and how the American story should be told. Because in the end, genealogy becomes most powerful not when it assigns percentages or claims famous ancestors, but when it reveals how ordinary people, servants and students, shoemakers and emigrants, landowners and laborers, moved through extraordinary moments in history, carrying their genes and their choices forward into futures they could never imagine, until all those separate paths converged in ways that make us reconsider everything we thought we knew about where we come from and who we are.